Hello, everybody. This is your video on the equation of a circle. So this one is pretty short. The basics of it is pretty short. So I've combined the notes and the practice into one video for you here. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump into it and talk about this stuff. So we have talked about the different parts of a circle. Um, and I'm hoping that you remember from your algebra classes, right, that we have certain functions that we can write equations for, right? Like lines and parabolas and all these other types of things that we can write equations for. Well, unlike a lot of shapes in geometry, circles also have an equation that we can write to describe them. So we don't just have to view them in just in blank space, but we can put them on a coordinate grid and actually graph them, and they have their own functions. Okay, so what you see on both the left and right side of your screen, okay, is the equation of a circle, which looks kind of crazy long, right? Which I get, okay? It looks kind of long and kind of complicated, but it's not as complicated as it may seem, okay? Because the only things that you change are this number h, this number k, and this number r, okay? H and k together tell us where the center of the circle is located. So h is the x coordinate of the center. Makes sense because it's in the parentheses with the x. K tells us the y coordinate of the center. Again, makes sense because it's paired with the y inside the parentheses. Okay, and r is the radius. Okay, so if you change h or k, you move the circle, right? If you change h, you move the circle left or right. And if you change k, you move the circle up or down. Okay. And then if you change r, you change the size, right? You make the circle bigger or smaller. Okay. Now, one thing that's important to point out in the equation of the circle is this. Okay, that within the parentheses, the general formula, the general equation has negative signs inside it, right? And I wrote it for you on your actual notes page. Notice how you have x minus h and y minus k. So if you see a plus inside the parentheses with the x or the y, then that means this number, the h or the k, has to be negative. Okay, so essentially, whatever you see in the equation for h and k, you have to switch the sign when you pull that number out of the equation in order to figure out where the center is, right? So if you see x minus something, then that means the number you pull out is positive, right? If you're asked to identify the center. If you see y, x or y plus something, then that means the number you have to pull out is negative, all right? So let me clear my screen here. Okay, and I have some examples for you here, but I'm actually going to move this a little bit, make this a little bit larger so that you all can see this a little better. Okay, so here we're going to use this information that we have in order to figure out what the center and radius are of the circles that you see here, as well as try to write some equations of our own. Okay, so they and obviously they get a little harder as you go through. Okay, so for identifying center and radius, I just have to pick out my three numbers right here. Okay, so since it's minus 6 inside the equation, I'm going to pull out a plus 6 for the center. Minus 1 pulls out a plus 1. Okay, and since it's 5 squared, right? Remember, 5 squared is r squared, right? So that means your radius is 5. Right? Pretty simple. Okay, but it gets a little bit trickier when you don't have this squared here, right? So again, let's look at center and radius. So since this is x minus 8, I'm going to pull out a plus 8 for the center. Now this, since it's y plus 2, I have to pull out a minus 2 for the center, okay? And then for my radius, the most common mistake that people make would be to say, oh, the radius is 16. No, wrong, okay? Right? Because in the actual equation, right, if you go back up to the equation, the number on the other side is not equal to the radius, but rather equal to radius squared. So what you have is 16 equals r squared. So whatever number you have right there, you have to take the square root in order to actually figure out what the radius is. So the radius of that circle here is 4, okay? So the last one here, notice that there's no parentheses and there's no numbers associated with x and y. Okay, what that means is that there's an understood 0 right there, right? Just having it plain, right, with no parentheses is the same as saying x minus 0, right? Because whenever you subtract 0 from something, it just goes away, right? So that means my center for this circle is 0, 0. Okay, and then my radius, I have r squared equals 5. So that means my radius, and I'm just going to leave it as a radical, and I'm going to write it as the square root of 5. You can plug this into your calculator if you want to, but you don't really have to. Okay? All right, you all. So I actually would like for you to give this part a try right here, which is working backwards. So this time I'm giving you the center and the radius, and I want you to try to write the equation of the circle. All right, so give it a try. Pause the video, give it a try, and then check back with me to see how you did. All right, folks, so go ahead and check your answers against mine. So for that first one, I have x minus 5 squared plus y minus 1 squared equals 9, because 9 is 3 squared. Okay, so remember, key for putting center into the equation of a circle is whatever sign you have, switch it before you put it inside the equation of the circle. Okay, so since 5 and 1 were both positive, they have minus signs in front of them in the equation of the circle. Okay, for the second one, I have x plus 2 squared and y minus 9 squared equals 16, right? Because 4 squared is 16. Notice that I have plus 2 there for x, since the original number in the center was a negative number. Okay, and then my last one here is just plain old x squared. I don't have a number associated with it because the center is at 0, right? I wrote underneath for you here the expanded version, but really this is the most proper way to write it, right? So I have x squared plus y plus 3 squared, since it's negative 3 inside the center, equals 25. 25 is 5 squared, all right? Okay, so the next little bit of this video is on this completing the square topic. Okay, so this is mostly an honors topic. So if you are not in honors, you can stop the video here or listen on in order to learn about this this extra topic. Okay, but honor students, stick around because you definitely do need to know this skill and how to complete the square. All right, so give me just a second to reset my screen, and then we're going to jump into this part. All right, everybody, so let's talk about completing the square. Now, when equations of circles are already in this lovely standard form, right, which is what we've kind of been talking about throughout this video, it's a lot easier to pick out what the center and the radius is, right? Because you have these rules you can follow. It's really easy to pull out from those equations what those numbers are, what the center and the radius are. But a lot of the times, equations of circles will look more like these really long equations that you see on the right side of your screen, where they're not in the right format. So the tool that we have to put them in the right format is called completing the square. Okay, so more often than not, okay, and you can kind of see this on the left side of the screen, that there's an actual visual for you here that shows you why it's called completing the square, right? So usually you'll have something like this, where you'll have x squared plus, I don't know, let's say 6x plus, and then it would have the y part as well, okay? This actually is an equation of a circle, but it's much more difficult to deal with, right? So the visual of what's actually going on here, okay, is that if you think about what x squared is, like visually, it's literally just a square where the side is, or each side is x, right? It's the area of a square where each side is x, okay? And then this little rectangle here, in this case, like in my example, would be like 6x, right? Where you have one side that is x length and one side that is 6, right? Or whatever this number is that you have in front of the x, right? Because you're essentially just doing base times height here, and you end up with a rectangle, okay? So what the rules for completing the square does is it takes the term, the bx term, so with a number in front of the x term, it takes that rectangle, splits it in half, okay, and kind of moves one half down to the bottom, okay, of the square here, okay? And then if you look at this picture in the middle, it almost looks like a square, right? So we've taken this rectangle here on the right and kind of divided it in half. So rather than this length, whole length now being 6, now in my example, now it's 3, right? 6 divided by 2. Right? So like this length here is 3, and this length here is also 3. Okay, so now we're just missing this little part right here in order for it to be a full square, right? Because essentially what you're doing is you're adding all of these together, right? We're trying to find the area of this new square, right? But we're missing this part here. But, right, if we think about our properties of rectangles, if, for example, this side right here is 3, that means this side must also be 3. Right? So what you have here is a square that has this side length, right? This original side length that you had, which in my example was 6, right? You have that same thing, but cut in half, right? And so then the number that you have to add in order to make this area, the area of this square complete, in this example would be 3 times 3. So that little area right there is 9, okay? So you can do the exact same thing to the equation, okay? Now, here's the deal. This genuinely is not something that you like need to know or memorize, like all of this visual stuff, but I think for my people who are visual learners, it does help you like visualize and actually see what's going on rather than just following a set of rules. Okay. But I know a lot of people are like, okay, that's a little too abstract for me. Like, that's a little bit much for me to, like, for my brain to wrap around. Can I just have some steps to follow in order to do this? And the answer to that question is yes. Okay. So there are just some simple steps that you can follow. If you follow those steps every single time, you will get the answer correct. Okay. And you can see the steps on the right side of your screen. Okay. So let's say we start with an equation that looks like this, and you can also see it worked out completely on the left side of your screen, okay, where I have the x's, the x squared, the y squared, there's an x term with a number, the y term with a number, and then there's this other constant right here, okay? So step 1 is to move constants to the other side of the equal sign, okay? So you don't want any just plain numbers on the left, right? And then regroup the x's and the y's so that they go together, okay? So for my example here, I'm going to have x squared, and then it's minus 8x, okay? And I'm going to leave myself a little space because I'm going to need it, okay? So plus, and I'm going to leave a blank right here, and then I'm going to continue with the y's. So plus y squared plus 2y, right? And then I'm going to leave a space plus, leave a space, and that equals, essentially what I did is I added 8 to both sides to cancel this out. So you end up with plus 8 on the other side. Okay, so that's step 1. Okay, step 2, you're going to follow this same process every single time for both x and y. Okay, circle the number in front of the x. Okay, pull that number out with its sign. Okay, divide that number in half, which is -4. Okay, put a little box around that number because you need to keep that number. Okay, and then lastly, square that number. So -4 squared is 16. Okay, remember, a negative times a negative is a positive, right? Once you have that, plug it back into this blank spot, 16, okay? And then we have our golden rule of algebra, which is whatever you do to one side, you must do to the other. So since I added 16 to the left-hand side, I must also add 16 to the right-hand side, okay? So let's do that again because we have to do the same thing for the y's, okay? So I'm going to pull out the number in front of the y, pull that number out. Actually, let me add a little, like, a little barrier here just to separate my x's and my y's. Okay, so I'm pulling out the number in front of the y with the sign, plus 2. Cut that number in half, so that's plus 1. I'm going to keep that because I'm going to need it later. And then I am going to square that value. 1 squared is 1. That number goes into my blank right here. So plus 1, which means I have to do plus 1 on the right-hand side as well. Okay, so that's step 2. That's where most of the math happens, right? The actual, like, arithmetic. Okay, so the step is, right, or the process is take the number in front of either the x or the y, divide it by 2, circle that number and keep the sign, square it, okay, and then I kind of combined to step 3 here, add that squared number to both sides of the equal sign. So my newly fully written out equation is x squared minus 8x plus 16 plus y squared plus 2y plus 1 equals, and I have 16 plus 1 plus 8, and that equals 25. Okay? Right? Now, step 4 says factor the x term, right, or the x grouping, and the y grouping, factor them into a perfect square binomial. Okay, now you all may or may not remember how to factor because that was a while ago that you did that in Algebra 1. Okay, but remember, factoring is the opposite of foiling. Remember when you would have like x minus 2 and x plus 7, and you would multiply the first terms together, the outer terms, the inner, and the last terms. You'd multiply those together and you'd get a longer trinomial that looked something like this. Okay, factoring is just the opposite. It's going from the longer trinomial into something that looks more like this. Okay, but there is a reason I made you box and keep the number that you have here. Okay, after you divide the number in front of either just the x term or just the y term by 2. Okay? Because the number that you kept with its sign, is what goes inside the parentheses. Okay, so now what I end up with is I have an x term, an x parentheses squared term, a y parentheses squared term, equals a number on the other side. Okay, and then I have here, so since for x, the one I kept was -4, this becomes -4 inside here. The number that I kept for y was +1. Okay, and I know I obviously did not like follow my like numbered steps here. Sorry about that. Because I did this the fifth step, which is to add all the constants on the other side of the equal sign. I did that already at the top here. So I actually had more space than I thought I did, right? But now, doesn't this look so much more like the equation of a circle? So if I wanted to point out or know what the center and radius of this circle was, it would be easy for me to identify, right? The center is +4, -1, and the radius is 5, right? Much easier than when it was written in this longhand form, the way it was written up here, okay? So the point of doing the completing the square is in order to make this equation of a circle look like what you want it to look like, to turn it and put it into standard form, right? That's always the goal of doing this, okay? So there's 2 example practice problems here underneath that I want you to try, okay? I'm gonna leave this slide that you see on the left up so you can kind of see the process, okay? But I want you to try these 2. Pause the video, try these 2, put both of those equations in standard form, and then check back with me to see how you did. All right, folks, go ahead and check your answers against mine. So I have followed the steps for both of these equations of circles. So first step, rewrite so that you can group all the x's or the x terms and all the y terms together. Okay, and then leave your blank space for the missing part of each of those squares. Okay, and then for the number in front of the x and the number in front of the y, you have to pull out the number with its sign, cut it in half, and then square that number. And then whatever number you get after you square must be added to both sides of the equal sign. Okay, so in that first one, I have -12, cut that in half, you get -6, squared is 36. So I added 36 to both sides. For the y, you have 8, +8 divided by 2 is +4, square +4, you get 16. So I added 16 to both sides. Okay, again, the reason that we do that is so that we can factor our x terms and our y terms together, right? So that it looks more like the equation of a circle that we're used to, rather than having it written the way it is now in standard form, okay? And then just as a reminder, after you divide your numbers by 2, you have to keep that one number that's for both x and y that you can see on the screen is boxed in blue right there, right? Because that number and sign goes inside the parentheses with your x and y respectively. Okay, so my final equation for the first one is x minus 6 squared plus y plus 4 squared equals 20. So if I wanted to pick out the center and the radius of that circle, I would say the center is +6, -4. Because remember, whatever you have in the original equation, you have to switch the sign when you're identifying the center. Okay, and then my radius would be the square root of 20. Okay, and then finally for that last one, same thing. Regroup so that the x terms are together and the y terms are together. Pull out the numbers in front of the x and y terms respectively with their signs, cut them in half and square them. and then add that squared number back in. Okay, so for the x in that second one, you have plus 18 divided by 2 is plus 9. I'm keeping the plus 9 because I need it later. Square that number, which is 81. So you add 81 to both sides. Okay, and then for the number in front of the y, you have minus 16. Cut that in half. That's minus 8. I'm going to keep minus 8 for later. Square negative 8, and you get plus 64. So I'm going to add 64 to both sides. So then with the numbers I kept, those go inside my parentheses in my general format for my equation of a circle. So I have x plus 9 squared plus y minus 8 squared equals 49. Okay. And one thing I forgot to mention, just to remind you, if you have a number, any number, on the left-hand side of the equal sign, make sure that you move it over to the right-hand side of the equal sign before you do anything. Uh, like before you follow the pull out the numbers divide by 2 square process. Okay, so for that very last one, if I wanted to pull out the center and the radius, I would say the center is negative 9, positive 8, and then that my radius was 7, because the square root of 49 is 7. All right, folks, so that is it for this video, and I will see you in the next one. Bye, everybody.